in a limited capacity. I'm on? Okay, guys, so welcome to another thrilling installment of It's Not a Good Day to Be Robert. These are supposed to be my greatest losses. But like I did last week, I don't like to just stay at the loss. So whenever I'm digesting a really heavy loss, I try to pair it with another game that maybe I won thanks to that previous experience, that was branded into me by the loss. So before we get into that silver lining, I did want to show you a game that I played last year in the last round of the US Open against a very strong player, Illia Nyzhnyk, who's actually, I believe, he's living here in St. Louis. Does anybody know? Yeah? I see him around, I think, Washington? Webster or Washington? Webster? Oh, okay. Because you have.
How could you lose to him? That's unacceptable.
Well, we're about to see how I could lose to him, and in fact, it's very easy to lose to Nyzhnyk because he is so good, and
You're better.
that is very debatable, especially after you see this game. So let's just get started. The game went c4, e5, knight c3. Knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and e3. And actually, one of the hard things about playing in the open tournaments here in the US, well, depends who you ask, right, is that the pairings get posted with very little time to actually prepare for the game. Some people see this as a positive thing because they feel like it doesn't interfere with just the raw talent or creativity with the game. So it sort of takes away the theoretical element out of the equation and the two players can just clash. But other players, and I would include myself in this other category, really like to have a little bit of time to prepare the game. And it's really not just about, finding some novelty in a long theoretical variation and just crushing our opponent in the opening. I think it's also about this other dimension of chess that's a lot of fun, which is playing over your opponent's games and starting to understand what kind of style they have, what kind of positions you should try to get, which ones you should try to avoid. It goes so far beyond the opening that I really like tournaments where I get the opportunity to prepare for the game like a day in advance. Like the pairings will get posted the night before, then I'll have a few hours in the evening to prepare, maybe a few in the morning, and then I can go to the game and see if I can implement a strategy that I've put together. In the US, you don't usually get to do that. Maybe at World Open, you'll get the pairings 5 or 10 minutes before the round starts. The US Open, it's not so bad. You might get them a couple of hours, maybe a few hours before the round. And that was the case with this game. It was the last round, so the round started a little bit earlier. And I had maybe a couple of hours to prepare for the game. And doing a database search, I found a game of Nyzhnyk's where he played this e3 move in the English, which might not seem like the main way that white can play. White usually goes for g3 and bishop g2, but this has really become popular recently. And the idea is to play a sort of reversed Sicilian, like 4-knight Sicilian or something like a Khan Sicilian. And it doesn't make sense because the Sicilian is a very interesting opening, I think we can all agree. And if you have an extra tempo, then it should be even more interesting. So that's really what white is aiming for. Yes?
What year was this?
2008. 18, sorry.
Can I ask
a
question?
Of course.
The thing is, when you play e4 and you went into, you're getting maybe a possible reverse. Is that, I know you're black, but doesn't that bother you going to be, the white has extra tempo? Why do you, yet you went into what's your thinking from your side?
Well, it really depends on my next move, right? So when I prepared this opening, my intention wasn't to play a regular Sicilian, right? Like open Sicilian after takes, takes. Because here this would be like a Taimanov Sicilian where white is just getting this free tempo of the knight on f3. So this wasn't what I had in mind. The move that I played was bishop b4, which would be like a reversed Rossolimo. Yeah.
But again, you're still playing aggressive middle with white with extra tempo.
Right.
And I'm just thinking from a point of view, if you're trying to win, why would you want to give white extra tempo in any, you know what I'm getting at.
I know what you mean. So let's say that when you're playing with white against a Sicilian, things can get pretty complicated, but white is always trying to fight for the initiative, right? Now, when you're playing with black, since you don't have that extra tempo, what is that going to translate into? How serious is that going to be? Okay, maybe you won't be able to fight for the initiative, but maybe you can get an equal position.
Okay.
So maybe I don't have to shoot as high, but I can aim for some middle ground that makes my position as black acceptable.
Okay.
And I had something very specific in mind too, because it's very difficult to get a dynamic position with white without incurring a lot of risk, right? Without going into some kind of mainline Sicilian where you're down a tempo. I definitely didn't want to do that.
Right.
So against queen c2, black has a couple of options here. One is to castle, which is what I did, and this is a little bit risky, and we'll see why in a moment. And the other option, and this is the one that you'll probably encounter in most chess books, is the move bishop takes c3, which also looks a little bit odd. Actually, castles looks much more natural. But after we see what happened following castle kingside, we'll see why bishop takes c3 makes sense. And the point is that after queen takes, now we go queen e7, protecting the e5 pawn, and preparing d5. Because now after c takes d5, knight takes d5, we're going to gain some tempi on the white queen. So for example, if white plays something like a3, after d5, pawn takes, knight takes, maybe queen c2, and here you would run into e4. And this position already starts to look a little bit uncomfortable for white because, well, your knight is probably going to have to go back to g1, and that's already going to put you back in terms of development, right? We could just castle, play something like bishop f5, knight e5, and try to get the knight to d3. I think this position looks pretty interesting for black. So normally here, instead of c takes d5, white goes for the move d4. And the idea is that after something like e takes, knight takes, queen takes, the arising positions are somewhat dry. And if black's not careful, you're just going to get a middle game where white has the bishop pair, and you really don't have much to show for it, especially if white gets to play b4 and bishop b2. So this was definitely not the kind of position that I was looking to play against Nyzhnyk, because he's also, you know, kind of a positional beast. And if you give him a good pawn structure and the bishop pair, he's just going to squeeze you for about 6 hours in the best case scenario. So thinking about this problem, I remembered an old line I had looked at a while back that looked really risky, but I felt that with good preparation, which I thought I had, later I realized maybe I didn't, to play castle kingside. And now white's idea is to play this very tricky move, knight d5. The point of knight d5 is pretty clear if black takes on d5, because now after c takes, this knight has to move, and now we lose our e5 pawn. So that's not good. And if we take on d5, I think we might have some pretty serious problems with our minor pieces. Are we winning anything with like queen b3? maybe, maybe not, right? Because if c6, if we go e4, then maybe rook e8.
Right.
I don't know what's going on here.
It's a little unclear.
It looks highly suspect, though. And the fact that nobody plays this way as black makes me think like this is probably better to stay away from. Instead, I played the move rook e8, which has the idea to take on d5 and then maybe play something like knight b8, right? If white does something random, I could also even consider playing e4. But here, the tricky follow-up that white has is queen f5.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
surprising.
So again, the point is to renew this idea. If knight takes, pawn takes, and when the knight moves, we take the pawn on e5. So it's not easy to get rid of the knight on d5, while white is also threatening to ruin our pawn structure with knight takes f6. And if we do something like bishop e7, well, aside from considering whether knight takes e5 works or not, which probably doesn't because of d6, white can just take the bishop and bank the bishop pair, right? And go.
I have a
Yeah.
You know, going back a move further, if I play d3 and I understand you're gonna pawn d6, and I understand you're gonna ruin the pawn stuff, but is it that bad with the queens off?
Well, this is actually what happened in the game.
Okay.
Now, I had actually prepared this variation thinking that he would go into it, and sure enough, he did. And here the main line goes something like queen takes, pawn takes, and now a3. And after the bishop moves, b4,
Right.
bishop b6, and I think bishop b2. There's a couple of high-profile games that were played here, but in general, this is a very pleasant position for white because you have a much better pawn structure on the king side, and you have a space advantage on the queen side. Black's not really able to generate much counterplay. Usually black will play a5 to try to undermine this queen side a little bit. And after b5, I think there's some Timon games as white, Smyslov maybe defending as black.
But basically what you're saying is that black is going to be defending.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So I decided to experiment with this strange idea. G takes f6, which still gives me a terrible pawn structure, but at least now I'm going to try to gain some tempi on the white queen while I activate my position.
Well,
And
did you get this in your preparation? Do you prepare for this?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I actually had played a game with G takes f6 a few years back. So I had some experience, but I never played it against a guy this good. And I was pretty sure he had seen this line as well. So I was kind of saying, okay, let's see what you got. So after G takes f6, he played the move queen h5. And I played d5. This is actually how my previous game had gone as well. And the point is that when this bishop gets attacked now, it can retreat to f8 and help out with the kingside defense. And what I would really love to play is e4 and start driving back the white pieces. And if I could play, something like f5 and queen f6 or bishop g7 and get my bishop active along the a1 h8 diagonal, then actually white might be under a bit of pressure. So white took on d5, and after queen...
Well, is the bishop back at this point?
Yeah, this was played.
Okay.
a3, bishop f8, c takes d5, queen takes, and now d3. And I was already trying to remember the positions that I had looked at because I mainly reviewed the old game that I had played where my opponent had played the move bishop d3. And the point is that after e4, the bishop can come to c2. And I can't take on f3 because the pawn is pinned. But this is really not a good line for white. Black can just take on c4 and eventually play something like knight e5. After takes and d3, the key for black is to be able to play f5 and get a queen to g6. If we manage to do this, then black is actually going to have a pretty good position. It sort of reminds me of the Sveshnikov Sicilian, where it looks like your pawn structure is absolutely horrendous, but all of a sudden, if you get a pawn to f5, the game becomes quite dynamic and full of interesting chances for both sides. But it's absolutely key to get f5 in. So think of this position, if you don't get f5 in, it's like a Sveshnikov where you never played f5, and that's just positional suicide. So I played the move knight a5, which is not a bad move, but it's definitely a step in the wrong direction. Because if what really matters is to play f5, I'm taking my eye off the ball completely, right? I'm going for the...
A5 now, is that playable now?
Knight a5?
Instead of the knight moving f5, is that playable now?
So f5 here?
Yeah, is that playable?
I actually looked at f5 for a while, and I think I saw this move bishop d2 as a problem. And the thing is that if I go queen e6, knight h4, and I can't get to g6, which is the dream square, right? If I could manage somehow to get this position and white would take on g6, well, this would be a dream come true, because I've fixed all of my problems. So after knight h4, I could go to h6, and then after takes, rook c1, white should be a little bit better here because of the better pawn structure, but it doesn't look terrible for black either, right? Maybe
it's a lot more active than the position where you traded queens earlier. I mean, when the queen, I'm talking about all the way back.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I would much rather play this position than the other one, because here I'm not getting overrun on the queen side. In fact, I might have some counterplay based on a5 and a4, and maybe knight a5 at some point. So I wouldn't be too upset with this, although black still needs to be a little bit careful. For example, g3, trying to go bishop g2 or bishop h3. I do have some important weaknesses that need to be taken care of. So, I don't know, I was looking at something like this and I thought maybe white's a little bit better. But not a bad option. But the most accurate move is actually queen e6.
Oh, well.
And the point of queen e6 is that if you go knight h4 now, well, this might lead to a direct transposition. So the difference, I guess, would be that, well, white didn't play bishop d2, rook c1, but I guess in the other line, you could do g3 right away as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So this could just be a transposition.
Yeah.
And if white simply, I don't know, develops with bishop e2, then f5, knight h4, and now I can play knight a5 and knight b3. I was actually fixated during the game with getting his dark square bishop. I wanted to throw in the moves knight b3, knight takes c1, and then continue with the f5 and queen g6 idea. If I'm able to do this, it solves two big problems. Number one, the possibility that white might play b4, bishop b2, and punish me along this long diagonal. But most importantly, it solves the main problem that you see white having in the regular Sicilian, which is the misplacement of this knight on c6. When you're playing with white against the Sicilian, your knight on c3 is your worst piece, whether you realize it or not. Because the knights in general don't like sitting in front of their pawns when they're on a half open file. Because at some point, a rook is going to get there and you're going to start feeling very uncomfortable. I'm sure that any of you that have played the Sicilian or studied Sicilian games have seen the exchange sacrifice rook takes c3.
Right.
So this is just an extreme example of how bad things can get if your knight stays on c3 or c6 in this case for too long. So I really wanted to get my knight out of there. And knight a5, knight b3 seemed like a very tempting way to do it. However, I didn't realize that white had a hidden threat in the position. So white played bishop d2, knight b3, rook d1, knight takes d2, knight takes d2. And now I played queen e6, which turns out to be a very serious blunder and loses the game on the spot, I would say. So, what would you guys play as white?
Good question. Set a move. They go there. Defend. I'm looking at d4 as a possible move.
So d4 here?
Yeah, but
D4
the idea of bringing the bishop in.
So d4 is actually what I was most concerned about if I had played f5 right away. Because I thought, well, now after d4, bishop c4 is coming, right? So I can't really go e takes d4 because bishop c4 wins the game on the spot. But I thought, well, I can just go queen e6. And I wasn't too concerned about bishop c4 anymore because now I just go queen g6. And that solves all the problems. So I was thinking, well, he can go d takes e5, and I'm going to be left with these horrendous doubled isolated pawns and a completely exposed king. However, this position isn't so easy. After queen takes e5, I'm threatening to play f4, undoubling my pawns and trading queens. Two really important accomplishments for black. So
Yeah.
if white does something like bishop c4, just bishop e6, and it doesn't really change things too much. Also, b2 is hanging. So I don't know, aside from bishop c4, is there anything else I should be worried about? Maybe knight c4? But this doesn't seem like it should be such a big deal. What's that? So knight f3 here? Maybe. Let's say I'll bite. Knight g5. Do I have like a check here maybe?
No.
Well, you're not gonna go bishop c4 now, so I can definitely.
Crazy here. Let's play. How about like let's put the rook up at least.
Okay, so rook d2. Fair enough. And
You still can defend.
I could go check, right? At least
Yeah.
maybe I have at least a perpetual because
Right.
if you ever go king e2, I can just go back.
Right.
And now this.
No. But this,
All right, but I'm gonna kick you out, and now I just win.
This could get really ugly.
It just got really ugly.
Yeah, it could get ugly quickly.
So
I would,
so I was thinking the only choice would be maybe knight c4, which attacks the
I'm
queen
looking- yeah,
and protects the pawn.
But
But
then you can move your queen back, right?
Yeah, I could do something like queen g7, so you still can't develop the bishop because g2 is hanging. I'm still threatening f4.
So, but do you have G?
Maybe g3, yeah.
That's a reasonable move.
Can you take on G2?
If you go here,
No, let's say.
well, maybe I can throw in this move first.
This is,
Because if you do this, now I have bishop g4.
this,
And if you castle, well, at least I'm going to get rid of this.
The positions getting complicated.
Well, yeah. I mean,
This-
it's something that we're not going to be able to escape because this g takes f6 line is inherently complicated.
Yeah. So,
But it's a nice question that the position poses whether these doubled isolated pawns are compensated by some kind of initiative.
So if you play G3 now, is that okay?
So,
do we have to like this?
well,
Move the queen back. Move the bishop to bishop back to C4, queen to G7, and then you play G3.
right.
Then,
What if I do this?
oh, well, interesting.
Because if you go pawn takes, I can go bishop G4.
Ooh, yeah, that's nasty. Yeah, yeah, you're right. So this is not so easy.
Not so easy at all.
No.
So this is what I should have played, but I got scared. I was like, why make my life so complicated, right? All these lines looked very complicated. When I can just go queen e6 first, avoid all of these d4 ideas, because of course now d4 doesn't make any sense. We just go d takes e4. And if bishop e2,
Okay.
then I can go f5, and everything's going according to plan. Most importantly, I've gotten my knight out of c6, and I'm getting ready to go queen g6.
Right.
But I missed something very important
Yeah.
in this position. Yeah,
I was kind of thinking of G4.
yeah. So g4 is just winning.
Yeah.
Because now that I've been stripped of my f5 idea,
And the rook is going to come in too.
yeah, white just clamps down on the light squares, and I have no counterplay whatsoever. So imagine a Sveshnikov where you never get to play f5, and white just gets a knight to d5, a knight to f5, and it's over.
Well,
So
yeah, the bishop bangs on it.
yeah, so right, the point is that if queen takes g4, I thought, oh, queen takes g4, nothing happens because the rook can't come to g1. But of course, white just trades,
Yeah.
and then goes rook g1,
It's the bishop.
and you lose the bishop. So
Oh, wow.
it was one of those moments too when you make the move, you let it go, and you instantly see it. Oh, g4, of course. And sure enough, you just blitzed it out, and I knew it was over. So after g4, things don't get better.
It's not feel so good.
No, I played f5 because I thought, well, if I'm going to lose, I at least want to play f5 at some point. I just can't go out on the street without having played f5. Or look at myself in the mirror. So after pawn takes, queen takes, rook g1. I mean, just to get an idea, I mean, if I do anything else, I can't even think of a legal move. Huh?
King H8.
All right, king h8. Great. Let's start. Well, they all look so nice. I suppose, should we go rook g1, bishop e2? Does it even? Okay, let's go rook g1.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
It gives you a lot of possibilities to get the rook in.
Right, and also it gives me the possibility of meeting f5 with takes and rook g5. So I don't have to trade queens. And now I can even start thinking about doing something like this,
Oh.
or bringing the knight to e4.
Yeah,
It's not going to be pretty.
if I open,
Bishop is7, rook g8.
Right here? Okay.
yeah, but this is,
All right, now it's worth looking at. So let's say I go bishop e2,
Rook g8.
and now knight e4.
Bishop d7, bishop c6.
Okay.
this
Yeah,
is a
bring
bit,
that rook in. Bring
you know,
it in.
but you know what's bad
Absolutely
about
smash
what
it.
white has a very
Bishop
comfortable,
c6.
all the pieces are coming in to nice squares.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
7, maybe win.
This is a very
Get
comfortable.
that knight to f5.
Well, you could have taken here first, but I don't know if that's going to make things better, because the opposite color bishops should. Well, maybe here. Well, but actually now, yeah, maybe like here. That looks like white's pieces don't look so smart anymore.
Mm.
So maybe this king h8 idea was a better way of holding on. Or at least it was a way of holding on. What I played
I think you're
was
still
not.
losing,
I think there must be something like
But-
d4, bishop c4.
So you're saying maybe after bishop e7.
I think like d4, bishop c4 maybe.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
That looks like an
You
interesting.
take bishop d3 and that's all.
Oh, wow, look at that.
That's what I like.
Oh yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, so that d4 looks good.
Yeah.
So I was also looking at threats.
Yeah. I mean, and if I go e4, then you just go bishop c4.
Yeah.
And f7 is hanging.
That's a killer.
Yeah. So there we go. Well, it's good I didn't miss a way to save the game then. That would have just made it even worse. Like this day just keeps getting worse.
To show it to all of us.
White has a very comfortable position.
Oh yeah, it's
Extremely
a pleasure to play with white because every move you make is just, you know, clamping down on these light squares even more. So in the end, I just played f5. Should I show it?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
It's easy for you to look at this. You're completely detached. But I'm reliving it. Volunteer is a strong word. They're making me show you this game. I want to show you some games I won.
I also have two people here lost to Nyzhnyk before, so.
Yeah? Okay.
Both lost to Nyzhnyk
All right.
before.
We'll meet at the bar later. So after queen takes, we went rook g1.
And I lost you last week.
Yeah, bishop g7, and there we go. Queen h6, and it's over.
Oh.
Yeah,
Yeah, that hurt.
I know. Tell me about it. I mean, there's really not much I can do anyway, because if king h8, I think rook g5 was what I was looking at. I mean, I can still hang on a little bit longer, but it's just a matter of time. Anyway, like I said, let's move on.
Okay.
Let's not stay fixated on this too long.
Okay. We understand.
Yeah, let's
Let's move on.
take a deep breath, you know. It's okay, it happens. Let's,
Everyone has had a bad game.
yeah.
World champions.
Now let's make the best out of this.
Wait, you lost it.
Can you hit control one or get rid of that?
Wait, you lost it 1900?
Which bar?
The bar at the top.
How do you do that?
Hit control one. Alright, hit control two.
Ah, very
Ooh,
nice.
I like that.
That is nice.
Are you okay without your little thing over there?
Yeah, I wasn't even reading off of that. I was just playing this game out of memory. All right, so it's important once you have these, you know, unfortunate slip-ups to really get back on the horse. I think that Keres used to say, when you have a bad tournament, you just got to go and sign up for the first tournament that you see out there,
Right.
and just get it behind you. The worst thing that you can do is just like sit at home for 2 weeks and, you know, just replay the game over and over again. So this wasn't the first tournament I played after the US Open, but it was relatively recent. I played this maybe like a month ago, and it was in an open tournament in Argentina. Now my opponent was rated about 2,000 FIDE, which I guess is like 2,100 USCF, but he was having an amazing tournament. He had 4 out of 4, I had 3.5, but he had already beaten like 3 2,400s in a row. So I was like, what's going on here? And I come to this game, and I make the first few moves, and he's just blitzing out all his moves. And goes queen c2, and I castle, and he goes knight d5. So I take off my glasses, and I'm like, oh, it's happening all over again. What?
You know, you studied your games.
Well, I didn't think the US Open games got published. So I started to suspect they did, because he's playing all these moves really, really fast. And, you know, after rook e8, he goes queen f5. And after d6, takes and takes. So by now, I'm absolutely certain this guy is prepped up to the teeth. And I really haven't let's say, revisited this variation very often after that. But in this game, he played queen c2.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is really sort of if you look up this position in the database, it's the most played move. Because again, white used to interpret this position as positionally oriented, right? Where you have the better structure and you just want to complete your development and get a good game. Now Nyzhnyk gave it a much more dynamic spin and really tried to highlight the kingside problems. Now, hopefully I've made a good case for black's position despite the game, where if black gets to play f5, things can get really complicated in an interesting way. With queen c2, I think white has more modest goals, but still black needs to play energetically. So the move is always d5 because it is essential for black to be able to tuck this bishop away on f8 and later help out on the king side. So he went a3, bishop f8, and now after c takes d5, queen takes d5, and bishop c4. So how would you guys handle this position? Yeah.
Queen c5.
Okay, so queen c5 is one idea. And after b4?
Just like queen e7.
Queen e7, and if I go, I'm looking at g4 and I'm getting terrified again.
Yeah, but how about this queen d6? It looks reasonable.
Okay, so queen d6, and is g4 possible?
Interesting.
I could even try to start with knight h4. The point is that white wants to clamp down on the light squares, particularly this f5 square. So any move that tries to do that should be at least interesting.
So you want to play queen d7 and try to gain some control over that square?
Queen d7, you might play g4 anyway.
Oh.
Has anybody seen the Fischer-Taimano? I know you did, you just saw it. Fischer-Taimano from the candidates match in Vancouver, 1971.
I remember seeing it, yes.
Yeah, well, this is basically the same idea. And the point is to play bishop f5.
Oh.
So this is going to take the edge off of white's pressure along light squares.
I like that.
And I really recommend you guys check that game out if you've never seen it. It is the textbook example of how to win an endgame with a good bishop against a bad knight, basically. But also, it happens to be very relevant from a theoretical point of view. I mean, that theory that Fischer sort of built in 1971 still stands today. So the point is that after bishop takes d5, bishop takes c2, you're really going to have a hard time controlling that d3 square, because my next moves are probably going to be something like rook a d8 or e4 or maybe knight a5, and this bishop on c2 is a real nuisance. So in the game, Taimanov played, well, d6, in this case d3, and now the queen can drop back, and this makes a huge difference to have the bishop in front of the queen. First of all, there's no g4 anymore, right? Because after bishop takes, I can take it and just play bishop g7, and I'm not pinned anymore, and I'm threatening the knight, and everything's okay. So it was really important to me personally not to let white play g4 in this game. I thought, if anything, if I might win or I might lose, but you're not going to play g4, not on my watch. So here he played knight h4, which is also a very logical move because we're fighting for the f5 square. This was a critical moment, and I thought for a long time, where would you guys retreat with this bishop?
G6. Undouble the pawns.
Which way? Because you can undouble them. Well, I mean, they're still going to be doubled, I guess, if bishop g6 and if he takes on g6. I won't undouble them, but at least I'll make my pawn chain better after h takes g6. Okay, and why do you like bishop e6 better than bishop g6?
So, like first, white doesn't get the bishop there, and also, like I sort of like the bishop on c4 better than the bishop on e5.
Yeah, so the problem if I go to g6 is that this bishop on c4 is just going to be unchallenged, basically for the rest of the game, right? It has this open diagonal to drill me on f7 for as long as white wants. And I thought that maybe bishop g6 actually was interesting because my next move would probably be f5, and you know, I'm blocking the g file. However, white has a really strong sequence here, which is just to take the bishop, and after pawn takes to go h4. And I have this hook on g6 that's going to allow white to open up the h file. And white will probably just go after h5, bishop d2, and castles. And the h file is going to be a real issue for me, let alone this bishop on c4 that's putting tremendous pressure on f7. So I think this would be strategically very complicated, maybe even busted for black. So the correct retreat is to challenge the bishop on c4. And after bishop takes e6, what do we capture with? Right, so pawn takes. Forever taking control over this key f5 square. Still, I think this is what white should have played. I'm not so sure that this is a trivial position for black, because even though the pawn structure did get a little bit better, this is not particularly good for black. Right? Like if white goes b4, what do we do? Rook a d8. That makes a lot of sense. And do I have to go king e2? Maybe I do. E4, and if I take, that's very bold. And here, oh,
But I have a question.
Ouch.
Instead of
Ouch.
going into this complicated line of white, you could have just, instead of playing b4, you could do something else, like this castle, and then
If you castle, you
like
take your pawn.
right now, would that be?
wait, so if you castle,
Yeah.
I guess we just go here?
But now you can defend the pawn, right?
E4.
Yeah.
I mean, white's probably better.
Well, you go here, right? I can probably just go f5. This knight is looking very forgotten about, very neglected.
Okay.
G2 and the knight goes to 4.
Okay, but maybe I can do something like this.
This is it.
Yeah.
This is it.
Or maybe I could throw in this move first, get your knight out of here so that against knight e5. Well, but then you could go knight e1 actually.
But it is.
So I mean, like that's fantastic, right? But
the black has active.
no, I think that once
Has active position.
once these doubled pawns get on light squares
Yeah.
and they make up for the absence of my light square bishop, the worst is over for black. So getting the pawn to e4 is a major accomplishment.
Okay. Yeah. So you really got to think about it. You have to really think about what the right move is.
Yeah, so I was thinking that b4 was probably the way to go, and after rook d8, maybe king e2 is not the best. I don't know. Maybe
E4 immediately for white. E4 for white.
e4 here.
Yeah.
Okay, and if rook d8. Wait, I also have like knight d4, which looks
Oh,
very.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Now you made that
It's like
knight a super.
it's like the elephant in the room. Like why?
Now that knight is a super knight.
Yeah, no, it's
I
not.
don't want a super knight.
When I see his knights, I think of them as octopuses more than knights. They're just reaching out in every direction.
But also rook d8 wins a pawn.
You know,
Well, yeah, because you can't go king e2, right?
You don't
Rook
want,
d8 might actually be better.
you don't want the knight to get to that square.
No, so I was looking at this, and if rook d8, maybe b5.
Right.
But it still looks sketchy because now both pawns are hanging, right? d3 and b5. So this doesn't help. And if king e2, this e4 move looks pretty cool too. And again, I mean, if I get this pawn to e4, then it's all good. And I guess I can't sacrifice the pawn in any way.
Could be rook d1 there.
Rook where?
Rook d1 in the end of this line, king e2, rook d8.
Oh,
Rook d8.
sorry, yeah.
No, but look at-
E4.
No.
And rook d1?
Why is this bad for? I don't know.
This is looking.
Like 95 even. Or
Oh, right. Doesn't really change things too much. Well, maybe you could.
No, that's terrible.
Oh.
This is
not good.
Right? This guy doesn't seem to be contributing too much. So I really like this e495 idea. So it seems like black really is able to generate some counterplay
Yeah.
to counterbalance this bad pawn structure. So now it's my turn to be happy, because here my opponent played this move, bishop b5. And when he played it, like, he didn't have a poker face. He like jumped in his seat. It was like, ah, you know. And I was like, oh, okay, so he blundered, I guess, because why else would you do that?
Yeah, I see how he blundered.
What did he blunder?
Do knight to d4.
All right. So actually, we have two good options, and my question was going to be.
Oh, wait, not knight to d4, knight to b4.
So they both look really tempting, and I mean, I had to spend like 2 minutes just to calm down and take my hand off of the knight and just really think
Right.
why one would be better than the other.
Right.
Because my first impulse is to play knight d4, like in any Sicilian.
I know, yeah.
But after knight to d4, things aren't that easy.
Yeah, do knight
Because-
to d4 instead.
Let's calculate. So after e takes d4, queen takes b5, d takes e5. Now at first I thought, well, I have to be crushing him here with bishop b3 followed by rook takes e5, but he can actually just, say, what do you got? Go queen e2, because after rook takes, you can go something like bishop e3. And he's getting ready to castle kingside. What's that?
I thought, black could play f5.
You could go f5, but I'm not sure that.
No, you don't. No, you don't.
Oh, yes, you can, right? Because here you have queen g4.
Wait, go back. Well, what if it did queen to a5? Check.
Queen to a5, and if queen to d2.
I was thinking bishop to b4, but then you could just take it to queen.
Right. So I spent quite a bit of time just looking for something here, and I just couldn't find it.
Yeah, knight to b4.
White's position is surprisingly resistant. Now, I said, okay, let's put a pin on that grenade and see if this makes any difference. Because now, after pawn takes, I have a couple of options, right? I can take the bishop right away, but I could also take on b4. So the question is, which one? Again, we have a fork in the road.
I'm just going to go with taking with b.
We have a fork in the road, no pun intended. So what happens after bishop takes b4?
Okay,
So bishop d2, right?
and then you trade that bishop off, take d2.
Right, so queen takes.
Yeah, and then queen takes b5. And
Yeah, and I was looking at this, and I knew I was up a pawn, and I felt like, okay, this should be better for black, especially because I might be able to put pressure on d3. But I also thought that this didn't look particularly great either. I felt like maybe at some point white could do something like e4 and queen h6. And I didn't want it to be one of those positions where I know I'm better, but I feel like I'm slowly losing grip on the position. So I said, okay, let's put a pin on the dagger in a2 and see if queen takes b5 offers anything else, because it would be much nicer for me to win the d3 pawn than the b4 pawn if I had to choose, because those doubled isolated pawns are not really going to provide white with any kind of counterplay. Whereas if white gets to play e4 and clamp down on the f5 square, I know from personal experience that bad things can happen. So this is what I ended up playing, because I was just very tempted to play rook a d8 and queen takes d3. And there was a nice cheapo as well that really sold it for me, which is after bishop d2, rook e d8. If white plays rook a3 protecting the d3 pawn, I have this nice move bishop takes, and if bishop takes, queen takes, and I pick up the knight on h4.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and here you really don't have a choice, because I'm threatening your rook, and you can't really put your rook along the third rank. So if you go back, then I can just take and then take on d3, and I'm up 2 pawns. Oh, rook takes and queen b4? Yeah, it's probably even better, right? Because queen here, check, here. I can just take it, right? Because if queen takes, bishop c4, it is game over. So instead of rook a3, my opponent went rook a5. And now after takes, rook takes, this position is basically over, because I have the bishop pair. I have pressure along the d file. The knight on h4 is kind of floating around. It's not clear that he's going to get to clamp down on f5. And even if he does, what's the big deal? I'm not going to get mated without queens on the board. So there was a couple of more interesting moments here. For example, after bishop c3, what's the correct plan for black here? Okay, so if rook a d8, obviously I can't take here because you win the rook on h1. But let's say that I go king e2.
Well,
Or castles. Yeah.
but the thing, yeah, but now you have the a7 pawn hanging.
Right.
You have to
And if
do
you go
something
if you
about
go
that.
and if you go a6, I don't know, maybe I get to go b5.
Yeah.
It's not clear, right? Because
Yeah, that makes this.
Yeah, I was gonna say
bishop c4,
Yeah, bishop c4, bishop c4.
and if takes,
And it takes rook e.
oh,
Yeah.
whoops.
Yeah, rook there.
Yeah, so this looks pretty devastating.
Or can you play b6, rook takes a6, and then bishop c4?
You know,
Well, but there you might have rook a1, right? So against, oops, wrong bishop. Maybe I can just go here. In any case, it looks like the bishop c4 right away really seals the deal. But I don't think white's idea is really to castle in these positions. White wants to keep the king more or less close to the center. Well, if bishop c4, now the king can come this way. The other option was to go e4, which looks a little bit better. But again, even here, maybe f3,
yeah.
f5. But maybe now I can take this
Because you
here.
run away. You run away.
I was hoping it'd be easier than this,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Bishop
Yeah.
a6 and e5. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
e5,
that's,
bishop c5.
no.
Is this?
It's really, this is getting very.
Yeah, yeah.
If you want to win, this is getting pretty complicated.
Yeah, it's getting too complicated for how winning I thought I was. So the idea I chose was b6. And the point is just to trade off this pawn on b4 that's restricting my bishop on f8.
Oh,
So
that's nice.
after bishop b takes, bishop takes, my bishops are starting to get into the game, and I can actually try to mobilize this 2 against 1 pawn majority. So I can go like a5, a4, b5, b4, a3. And I thought if I do that, it's just over, because I'm going to queen the pawn. Especially with the bishop on e6, if I get a pawn to a2, it's just easy.
Oh, this is a very logical way of playing it.
Yeah, so I thought, oh, I had this moment of clarity, now it's going to be easy. I actually almost lost this game again. So my opponent plays g4, and here I was like, okay. I know it shouldn't be bad, but I'm still not happy to see this move on the board. So I just played a5, rook g1, and h6, right? Because the threat of g5 is surprisingly annoying, because then he takes on e5, and the dark squares really start to fall apart. So I have to stop this. And now he plays knight f3, trying to go h4 and g5.
He's determined.
Yeah. So well, if you play rook here, after h4, what are you going to do? Okay. It's kind of annoying.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So we really can't let our guard down here. We have to find the right way of dealing.
You really have to play your hard game. You have to think every move.
Yeah. You can't just coast through this game.
Right.
So I thought for a while, and I played king h7. And the idea was that after h4, I can bring this rook as backup. Because after g5, I can throw in the move e4. And when the knight moves, I just go f5. And now when the king moves, I close everything down with h5. And at least this is not going to get open or anything. Sure, if the white knight ever gets to f4, that might be unpleasant, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, right? This knight is really far. Yeah, okay, that's even harder. So, so how would you guys play here?
Did you read this?
This happened in the game.
Okay.
So this is another critical moment in the game, and I think this is where black really can lay the hammer down. Rook c3 and then f6. I don't think we really need to take any measures on the king side. I mean, I just worked really hard to close the king side down, because that's not the area where I feel like I'm going to win the game. Especially the combined action of the rook on g1 and bishop on c3. Who said f4?
So if I play bishop,
Yeah.
bishop c,
Well, bishop c4 actually might just help white
move
with
back.
king e1 and make this maneuver possible.
Okay.
But the move
It's
Julian,
helping.
yeah, the move Julian just mentioned, f4, really is the correct move, because this is going to activate this bishop and also just crack open the position for the bishop on c5 as well. So after takes, rook f3, knight e3, rook takes f4. This is just over because h4 is hanging.
Right.
The knight is never going to reach either f6 or f4. And I think really white's position is collapsing now. So unfortunately, I did not.
Hindsight is always 20.
Yeah, but I was trying to play for some kind of f4 ideas, but I always said, oh, let me just prepare it one more move. You know, I'm not ready yet. And that's really, when you see a good idea, the more you delay it, the less strong it becomes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I played rook d8 first, and after knight g3, king g6, king e1, and I just started, you know, losing the thread here. Bishop b3, king e2, and here was really probably the last chance to go f4. And after knight takes, bishop takes e3. So this is probably going to lead to a winning opposite color bishop endgame. Instead, I managed to lure his knight to f4 after some very uninspired moves. I played b4 here, rook here, and now knight e2, and I was like, oh, he's threatening knight f4, which is devastating.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah, so here the only move to stop knight f4 is bishop d6. Well, if you go rook c8 right now, I'm going to be able to go f4.
So knight f4.
Oh no, actually I have checkmate, checkmate.
Checkmate is better.
Checkmate is even better. But if he goes knight f4 right now, after takes, he's threatening rook c8 followed by checkmate. Right here, here, and here. And when I saw this, I was like, this isn't happening. This can't be real. So I actually thought really hard, and I was like, okay, the only move is to go here, so against rook c8, I can give up the exchange. And I think this is probably still winning for black. Undeservedly, completely undeservedly.
Oh, really? Wow.
Well, I mean, because it was such an easy win, and I have to resort to this. So here, I go bishop takes f4, and my opponent looks at me like with a grin. It's like, oh, I got you now. And he goes rook c8, which is a terrible blunder. I mean, he's threatening checkmate in 3. 1, 2, 3. But what did he miss? What's that? Well, if rook d1, he just takes, and after I take, king e2, doesn't really change things too much. Huh?
Oh, rook takes e4. Oh, yeah,
Rook
rook e3.
e3, and can I just take it?
I mean,
And f4 in the end.
What's that?
And then f4 in the end. Like take, check, and f4.
Okay, this is probably even really good for black too. We'd have to see what happens if I just go here, though.
Oh. That's scary.
do you Grandmaster this? Wait, just take the bishop.
I'm not taking the bishop. I want to checkmate your king.
No one needs your bishop.
That's why he didn't take the rook.
Yeah, I mean, you just gave me a rook, and I said no. I'm going to say yes to a bishop.
Bishop takes g5 finally.
Ah, well, bishop takes g5 is really the idea that he missed. So there are several moments where you can play it, but after bishop takes, he doesn't have enough time to give check because the bishop is hanging. So once he takes, I just go f4, and now the king starts to run. Yeah, now this is just winning, and I did win it. So yes, it wasn't easy.
But he gave you a tough game.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. You know, I had to really struggle with it. But I think that these two games put together really help you understand not just the openings, but also how you should react to a bad situation. I mean, it's not like one bad game and you should never play this line ever again. I mean, I think the line is very risky for black, obviously, but it is interesting. I mean, if you put it to the engine says, go for it, you'll be fine. Of course, in practice, it's a little bit different. But I don't see black going for this line a lot, and I've been working on it, and I think it's pretty interesting, so I hope it'll catch on. And if you do play it and you lose, don't blame me, because I lose too sometimes. All right, so thanks for listening.